that was a big identity shift for me. And my Christianity was so tied to that identity of being a pastor or a professional Christian, as people sometimes say with a wink, that then I had to recalibrate, well, what does it mean for me to be a Christian if I'm not a pastor, if I'm not in a pulpit, if I'm not in charge of a staff meeting, I'm not going to do those things anymore. Like, that part of my life is over.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Our show is powered by you, the listener. If you want to support the work that we do, get early access to episodes, episode guides, and more, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture to become a monthly patron so that we can continue in this important work. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each week. And go leave a rating and review. It's easy. It only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. Just go to the show page on the app that you're using right now and hit 5 stars. It really is that easy. Thank you so much. You know what else would help us out? Share this podcast with your friends, family, your network. Tell them how much you enjoy it and let them know that they should be listening as well. If you're new here, welcome. If you want to dig deeper, find us on social media at Shifting Culture Podcast, where I post video clips and quotes and interact with all of you. Previous guests on the show have included Brian McLaren, Mark Scandrett, and Sarah Bessie. You can go back, listen to those episodes, and more. But today's guest is Tony Jones. Tony speaks, writes, and podcasts from Minnesota, where he lives with his spouse, dogs, and kids. Tony Jones is the author of The God of Wild Places and contributing writer to several outdoor periodicals. He's written a dozen books, including Did God Kill Jesus and The Sacred Way, Spiritual Practices for Everyday Life, developed the iPhone app, hosts the Reverend Hunter podcast, and teaches at Fuller Theological Seminary and the Loft Literary Center. He writes a weekly newsletter on Substack. Tony is a sought-after speaker and consultant in the areas of emerging church, postmodernism, and Christian spirituality, writing, and the outdoors. He served as a consultant on the television show The Path, and he owns an events planning company, Crucible Creative. Well, what would you do when all you've known just disappeared, when the construct of your own spiritual life was just removed? Well, what Tony Jones did was enter wild places. In it, he found a new connection to God, to his dogs, to nature, and the world that is teeming with life. In this conversation, Tony shares about the ups and downs of ministry and family life and how he recalibrated his identity as he moved out of the vocational role as a pastor and into wild places. So join us as we discover the God who sees us and is with us, even in creation. Here is my conversation with Tony Jones. Tony, welcome to Shifting Culture. Really excited to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
I really appreciate the invitation. It's great to see you, and I look forward to our conversation. Yeah.
Me too. I would love to start a little with your story of, a lot of your story is significance of church and Jesus in your own life as you're growing up into who you are and you're becoming a man and finding yourself, and then, your journey out of the church into the wilds and finding God in wild places. I'd love to start early on. What was the significance of church and Jesus growing up and then into your early 20s?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I grew up in a church family. I mean, we grew up, it was a funny church. It didn't really fit in the categories that we think of as like in Protestantism of evangelical or mainline. It was really a combination of that. Like our youth pastors kind of came out like of a young life type model, so that was very evangelical. But the senior minister had gone to Harvard University and to Union Seminary in New York City, which is like really liberal now. It wasn't quite so liberal then, but he came out of a much more of a mainline congregationalist vibe, like the ministers wore robes on Sunday morning with white preaching tabs and like academic hoods. So it was very traditional in that sense, a choir with robes on and a big organ and stuff like that. But also like our senior minister spoke in tongues every year on Pentecost in the pulpit, and was like he was ardently pro-life, but had a bust of JFK, a bronze bust of JFK on his desk in his office. So, I mean, it was like one of these deals, and it wasn't until I went to college when I started, and I write about this a little bit in the book, but I went to college and didn't really know that there was such a thing as evangelical or mainline. All I knew was my church. I went to seminary at Fuller. I arrived at Fuller in the fall of 1990 after graduating from college. So yeah, then I went to an evangelical seminary, but I didn't really consider myself like a traditional evangelical. And did some mission work on an Indian reservation, and then took a job at my home church as the youth and young adult pastor, and did that for 7 years before going to Princeton for a PhD in theology.
And so as you're starting to do this, you go to Princeton as you were getting involved in the emergent church movement and starting to gain some popularity. You're starting to write, you're starting to get all this work out, being able to speak publicly. Where was that trajectory leading you? What was that like?
Oh man, I mean, it was a heady time. We were the it boys of the church for several years, and kind of had this 10-year run, and right it from 99 to 2010 basically, and right in the middle of that 03, 04, 05, it was crazy. It's hard to even, I don't know that could even happen today, like that there would be a movement in Protestantism that would it would have so much impact on both evangelical and mainline circles. And we had both. One of the things I sometimes say is like, within the same year, we were on the cover of Christianity Today and the Christian Century. So like the flagship magazines of evangelicalism and of the mainline, like of conservative Protestantism and liberal Protestantism, we were on both. Like, can you imagine today, who other than a politician or something, like what church movement would be on the cover of both those magazines? They're just so far apart. They move in such different worlds. And for some reason, we hit the zeitgeist, and you'll remember this. I mean, part of the zeitgeist was we had Gen Xers in our churches, and that was like the bright, shiny object to get people to pay attention to us. Is like, holy crap, how are you getting Gen Xers? It must be the couches and the incense or whatever. And we're like, well, that's like the gateway drug, but why don't you come listen to what we're actually saying? And what we're saying is there needs to be a recalibration of the entire gospel message, not just like, we're not changing, one of the metaphors we used at the time was, we're not just changing the picture frame, like we need to repaint the picture. And that's where, we started getting pushback because the mainline churches didn't want to change the frame. They really like that frame, the liturgy and, the way that their ordination process and the seminary and the ways that they do things. And the evangelicals were like, no, nobody gets to repaint the picture. The picture is what it is. So, then there was kind of a rub and which was fun for a while, but ended up probably being a big part of the demise of the emerging church.
Yeah. And so there was a demise. I want to hit on some of these themes within your book that I have been pulling out. And this, your book is full of, fantastic writing. So anybody who loves to read and loves story, I think this would be a fantastic book for them to read because it's just well written and great. But I think a big theme in here for me is the theme of identity and where you find your significance. One, finding your significance within the institution of church in Christianity as the as the business is the model. And then also then finding your identity and slowing down out in the wild, wrestling with, your identity, family identity, like what is coming from your father, dealing with him and his death. What is that significance for you of identity? And has there been shifts over time? And what kind of identity shifts have you moved into?
That's incisive of you to ask that, because it's almost like it's something that has occurred to me after publishing the book. I don't know that I even use the term identity in the book, maybe, but it's not an explicit theme. But for sure, I think in retrospect, I look back and it's an implicit theme. Because as you know from the end of the book, I make one more run at being a pastor. And I applied for a job that I was recruited to apply for at a really big church. It would have been a very high-profile gig that would have paid a lot of money and put me in a big pulpit every Sunday, and I didn't get it. And that was, it was a punch in the gut because of identity. I think it wasn't so much about the rejection, because, people don't get jobs all the time. Like, that's part of life. It's not the end of the world. But I realized that I saw myself as a pastor and nobody else did. Like, I was the most qualified person for the job. They even told me, the chairman of the search committee even said, like, you're by far the best preacher. I mean, I got a PhD from Princeton. I've written all the books. I'm like the quintessential candidate for a big steeple, rich mainline church, And yet, when they looked at me, they didn't see pastor. That's not, and so I had to disabuse myself of that. I had to stop seeing myself as a pastor because nobody else saw me as that. And I don't mean pastor in the vague sense of like, oh, I'm still ordained, I'm still a reverend or whatever. I mean pastor in like probably the sense you do it, of like a shepherd of people. That's in the traditional sense of that term, over a congregation or a group of people, and shepherding them spiritually. So that was a big identity shift for me. And my Christianity was so tied to that identity of being a pastor or a professional Christian, as people sometimes say with a wink, that then I had to recalibrate, well, what does it mean for me to be a Christian if I'm not a pastor, if I'm not in a pulpit, if I'm not in charge of a staff meeting, I'm not going to do those things anymore. Like, that part of my life is over. So yeah, I mean, I think I recast myself as an outdoorsman, a Minnesotan. I think of myself, Christian is, for me, probably more like in the mix, like it is for most people, not for most pastors, where it's like front and center. So yeah, the identity, that's, like I say, it's an incisive question because it gets to the heart of like what I'm struggling with in the pages of the book, and that is, who am I if I'm not a pastor?
Yeah. I mean, this is significant for all of us because we all struggle with identity, and where do we get our sense of significance from? And where do we get our sense of worth and value? And is it in the affirmation of others? Is it the church that picks us to be their shepherd, their pastor? Or is it in selling a bunch of books? Like, where is this? What was it like for you in a place? And you write about this as well, that in that time when you were speaking and sharing, and you're up, and a lot of people are looking to you. Your home life, your relationship with your first wife, it was not working very well, and it wasn't going well. What was it like to be somebody that people looked up to in a place where, and then you knew that back home it was just a struggle, and you were struggling personally in that space?
Oh man, Joshua, it was. I'm not alone in this. I think there are probably a lot of people who have this, and it's not just in the church world. What it was really discombobulating. because I think I'm not unique in this. People have this in the corporate world or whatever. They're reaching the apex of their profession, and meanwhile their personal life is falling apart. Like, you know what I'm saying? This isn't uncommon for this to happen. It happens to clergy people, but it happens to big time professors. It happens to corporate leaders. It happens to nonprofit leaders, whatever. Like, we sometimes are clicking on all cylinders in one part of our life, and the other part of our life, like those cylinders are running out of oil and about to freeze up, and the engine's going to explode, you know? And that's what happened with me. Yeah, it was really discombobulating. And of course, and I won't even blame my ex-wife for this. I think this is just what happens. And it's kind of like, you know, when we're in a relationship that's dying, a lot of times we try to hurt the other person. And I did that, and she did that. And one of the ways she did that was, you know, she'd be like, "You're writing these books on prayer, but I know the truth. You don't really pray that much. You know, like you're basically faking it. You know, you're a shyster. The whole thing is a scam. You know, you're just another false religious leader." And I'm like, "No, I'm not. No, I'm not. No, I'm not." But there's, of course, enough truth in that statement, because there's always a little grain of self-doubt for any of us who are spiritual leaders. And I'm like, oh my gosh, is she right? Like, am I a false teacher? You know, so that was a part of it that was super hard and scary. You know, I was just scared. I'm scared. I'm like, she's going to tell people and I'm going to get found out. You know, imposter syndrome starts to creep in. So yeah, man, it was like, it was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Absolutely. I would be on a plane somewhere incredible, like, oh, I'm on a plane. I land in Kuala Lumpur for a week of speaking gigs. Like, this is, whoever would have thought this would happen. And then, you know, I check into my hotel, flip open my email, my computer, and look at my email, and it's just like a string of 10 emails that are just like all of our conflict written down, you know. And so then I'm like, okay, I got to pull it together because I've got a week of speaking in Kuala Lumpur. But meanwhile, you know, on the other side of the globe, my family life is like coming apart at the seams. Brutal, man. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how else to say. Like, did I deal with it well? Not really. Could I have done better? I don't know. You know, the nice thing for me was writing the book. Just gave me an opportunity to process it, and to process it in a way that I hope is, you know, helpful to other people, and I made, you know, I don't, as you know, having read it, I don't like really air dirty laundry about that marriage. That's not the point of the book. So that's not what it's about. It's about my own inner journey and try to figure out who I was and who I'm becoming.
Yeah. I think in moments like that, when things are falling apart, it's really helpful to have people around you that will be honest, that will tell you the truth.
Yeah.
And, you know, one of the things I love in your book, the story when, you know, Mark Scandrette tells you through tears that your marriage is over.
Yeah.
And he's honest.
Yeah.
I think, you know, Mark is a beautiful soul. I've had him on the podcast.
Yes.
He's awesome. I love Mark Scandrette. But
yeah,
what is it like to have people that can be brutally honest with you in difficult times and situations in your life, especially when you're at a place where you're on stage a lot? People, I mean, there's a lot of people don't know the inner workings of you, but there are a few that will come around you, will be with you, and through tears tell you the truth.
Boy, what's that like? I mean, I don't know if I'd be alive if it weren't for those people. There was something providential, you know, God's hand in the fact that at the very worst time of my marital life, in that first marriage, in the summer of 2008, I ended up in an RV on a 35-city book tour with Doug Padgett and Mark Scandrette. Two guys who loved me and also are confident enough in themselves that they can speak truth. They're not going to be passive-aggressive about it. They're not going to beat around the bush. They're just going to speak truth. I mean, that night with Mark, I remember, Mark just stayed at my house last week, and I remember, and Doug came over with him, and I have this very vivid memory of like the RV, we're driving in the RV, and they're seeing like, they can tell I'm in turmoil, and they're seeing like the text messages coming in. This is 2008, so I don't know, maybe I had an early iPhone, or maybe I even had a flip phone or something, but they're seeing like, I'm getting like 40 or 50 text messages a day, and they're like, something's off, something's wrong. So they start asking me stuff, and I remember, and I don't know if this is inappropriate for your podcast, you can cut it out, but at some point, one of them asked me like, well, how often do you have, they're asking me all these questions about my marriage. How often do you have sex, And I tell them, and it's not very often. They're like, and one of them said, man, that's not a marriage. I was like, what? I just remember that quote. That's not a marriage. And I'm like, well, what is a marriage? That it caught me so off guard, and I remember it so like I remember where we were sitting, each of us on the RV, when one of them, I don't remember which one of them said it because it was kind of a rapid fire conversation, but I just remember that line. That's not a marriage, and I'm like, oh crap, what am I in if it's not a marriage? And so to have people speak truth like that, oh my gosh, it's such a gift. It's such a gift. I just did it. Frankly, I just did it this morning in a very, very difficult situation in my own extended family, where there's some illness and there's probably someone approaching the end of their life, and everyone's been cagey about it. And, it's hard to talk about. Nobody really wants to broach the subject because it's very, very tragic. It's a young person with cancer. And yet I'm like, okay, I think we're at the point now where we have to start talking about this. And so anyway, those are hard. Those are so hard, but so necessary, I think, to live our full humanity. Yeah. And look, I mean, Jesus didn't shy away from hard questions like that. If there's one thing, right? If there's one thing, it's that guy, he spoke right to people's hearts. And it's a great model for us to follow.
Yeah, I agree. And great. After things started to fall apart for you, and you then ended up going into the wild, for somebody like you, I mean, your story, hey, you weren't a hunter for a long time, and now you're out in wild places as a hunter. You're there. What made you start to move towards the wild, the backwaters? What is that? How did you just feel the impetus to go?
Yeah. I in the book kind of opens, one of the opening scenes is me on a duck hunt when I was a youth pastor, and a guy in the church took me on this duck hunt after sensing that I had some issues and I had some anger problems. And, I write pretty vividly about that trip, and particularly one night on that trip. And so something about that trip stuck with me. And I didn't even really know it at the time. I couldn't have articulated it at the time. But then, 10 years later, when things are coming apart in my life, there was something about that experience with Doug, that made me think I should go do that again. Like that, I want to feel what I felt in that duck boat. I would like to feel that again, because that was what I needed at the time when I was in some turmoil. And so I just started doing that. I just started finding ways to do it. In fact, I posted back when people blogged, this was 15 years ago, I posted on my blog that I would preach for free in exchange for hunting. Like, I didn't know where to hunt. I didn't know who to hunt with. I didn't have contacts. My dad didn't hunt. I was on my own. And it's hard to break in. That's kind of a hard community to break into, the hunting community. So I posted that on my blog, and like 2 weeks later got an email from the Episcopal priest in Huron, South Dakota. And she said, come on out, and I like looked it up on Wikipedia, Huron, South Dakota. Oh, it has a statue of the world's largest pheasant. I thought, well, that's a good sign. Okay. And off I went to Huron, South Dakota, and I preached to her congregation of 15 people. It was, Joshua, it was a far cry from, traveling business class to Malaysia to preach in front of big crowds, or South Africa, or all these places I'd been. Now I'm in Huron, South Dakota, preaching to 15 people in a little Episcopal church. But then I'm going out with a guy and we're pheasant hunting for 2 or 3 days together, and then I'm doing it in Gackle, North Dakota, for a congregation that's even smaller. In fact, the first time I went to Gackle, there are 2 churches. There's a Lutheran church and a UCC church. And the Lutheran church shut down for that Sunday, and all the Lutherans came to hear me because I was like a guest speaker. So now there were like 20 people in the church. And then I got to go duck hunting with this old farmer for a few days, and so I started doing stuff like that. I loved it. I just loved it. I loved not only the activity of the hunting, which I really, really love, but the people I was meeting. They were just, I had lived in, as you've already kind of noted, like I lived in this very kind of heady life of, I'll never forget, like invited to, when in the summer of 2008, come to Chicago and have a meeting with Barack Obama, the presidential nominee for the Democrats. And people were calling me up, and I was getting quoted in the New York Times, and I'm flying around and doing this and that. And I'm then getting a PhD at Princeton. These are, these are heady kind of, these are high caliber kind of environments. And I moved around in those just fine. But then when I fell off that high perch, I landed in Gackle, North Dakota, I found out, I'm like, I actually think I like it better here. I think I like Harry Krause, this 78-year-old farmer who kind of still speaks with like a German bohemian accent, even though he's lived his whole life in North Dakota, but that's small town North Dakota for you. I kind of like this better, I think. I feel I can just be myself here. I'm not acting. I'm not playing a role. I can be myself. And so that was also a big part of back to your earlier question about my identity change, I found myself sitting with people who had very different life experiences than me, different politics than me, and none of it mattered. They were just happy to love me for who I am.
So then moving, that's a huge shift, moving from heady conversations, the head space, into space of the body, and using your body to be in nature, to really commune with the created world, which is a lot different. What new things were you learning once that you got into your body more and out of your head?
Yeah, good question. 2 things that come up a lot in the book. One is my connection with my hunting dogs, which I write. I have a whole chapter about dogs, and so that's one thing, my connection with the dogs, and then through the dogs kind of becoming more connected to the created order in general. And the way I write about it in the book is I stopped looking up, always looking up and out for God to come in from the other place, and break into this place and do something. Instead, now I'm looking, I really do think God is infused in all of us, and I think our creation is God touched or God blessed, so there are marks of God all around. But then I think the most radical thing for me that I learned was meat. And I have a whole chapter on butchering meat, which I think probably catches some readers off guard, but getting in touch with the butchering of the animals I kill and then that I eat, getting more in touch with the things I put in my mouth and eat and feed my family has become so important to me, like this crazy spiritual practice for me, the act of butchery. And I remember hearing years ago the theologian Stanley Hauerwas, he was quoting like a friend of his who's a rabbi, and he said, the mark of a true religion cares about what you do with your genitals and what you put in your mouth. So, there's like rules around sex, and there's dietary laws, right? And almost every religion has these. So there's something about that. There's something about what we put in our mouths that's always been a central concern to religion. And people like you and me 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, that is the priestly or clergy class, we did the butchery. Like, that's who did the butchering for the most part, because it was a sacred act. It was ritualized, the butchery of animals, and then the dispersal of the meat to the people in the tribe or the people in the town, or even in Jerusalem, to the people who came up for the festival, and then they'd go and be in the temple, and all these animals are sacrificed, and that meat wasn't thrown away. Like, that meat was then eaten, and it was considered like a sacred, holy act to do that. So I've tried to recover that in my own life, and then in the writing the book, try to kind of evangelize about that too. I really think we need to be more involved with what we eat. It makes us better humans. Yeah.
My most favorite communion experience that I've ever had in my life is we worked with Syrian refugees in Jordan. And so one of the Muslim holidays, Eid al-Adha, they celebrate the fact that, God saved Abraham's son and with a ram. And so they sacrifice sheep during that time. And so we wanted to do some of that. So we went out and we got a sheep with our friend, a Muslim follower of Jesus. And we went out, we bought the sheep. He said, we don't have to do this. We're just remembering Jesus' sacrifice, yada, yada, all of that. He's like, we don't have to do it, but we're doing it to remember Jesus. And he kept on reminding us. So we went there, we got it butchered in the courtyard of his house.
Wow.
Of like right in front of his house. It was like the throat was cut right there. The blood was coming out. They took everything out. And then they were, taking everything, started to butcher it. And right away, the fat on the sheep's butt, they cut off, they gave it to the women, and then they cut some meat off. And the women went to go cook right away.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So they cooked, and then, they divided it. Some went to neighbors, some went to family members, and then we kept a third of it to eat. And so as they came out with freshly cooked lamb from what we just butchered and killed right here, we sat around and we just gave thanks, and we were there, and it was a thing. I had some friends there. These are Muslim followers of Jesus. We're coming from different cultures, different places, but we've just had this experience of, I have now seen it with my eyes. It's something I'll never forget, because it's really like the first time I got in touch with all of that. But it's been, we've had traditions like that for years that we've lost. We've lost the tangible, the touch, the feel, the smells. We got nice little grape juice and little crackers,
Yeah.
Like,
I know. And it's amazing to me how many people will say, yeah, I don't even want to know where my meat comes from. I just want to go to the store and buy it and not even think about it. I'm like, wow, I don't get that, choosing not to be conscious about the food you eat. But that's a new thing. That is a new thing for human beings. That is not, for the vast majority of our time span as a species, we have been doing what you saw done. And that's those of us who eat meat, butchering meat, and the vast majority of Homo sapiens for 100,000 years have eaten meat.
And, how do we get back in touch with wild places? How do we get back in touch with what we're putting in our mouth? How do we get back in touch with creation? Since we do have a place, we get further and further away from it. We're paving over things. We're trying to tame things all the time. We're trying to control it as humans. What is it about the untamed world, and how do we get back into this untamed world that we could start to find our way back to where we belong?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we got to fight for it, for one thing. I mean, I belong to several conservation organizations that are constantly fighting, not necessarily fighting human development, but trying to save the wild places that still exist and keep them wild. Because, I'm a big proponent of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, which is a 1 million acre wilderness, no motors allowed of any kind. It's travel by canoe and foot. I go there every year. I write about it in the book. I guide trips there, usually of pastors, actually, who go up in there with me. And, there were people like guys like Sigurd Olsen and Aldo Leopold who fought to save those places. There's people like John Muir who fought to save Yosemite and keep it from being developed. Like, we have to, and this is obviously what we have in the United States that they do not have in Europe, is we have, thanks to people 125 years ago, like, Theodore Roosevelt, they protected a lot of land. And but there's always a human impulse, like you already said, to pave it over, develop it, to somehow tame it, right? And so I think that's a big thing we can do, is just like advocate. I mean, I'm constantly writing my elected representatives about, this or that issue of, like, let's keep these public lands public, let's keep the wild places wild, stuff like that. And then on a personal level, there's all sorts of ways to do it. I mean, it happens mainly by going outside. I realize that not everyone's going to want to hunt. I realize that the killing of animals or the use of firearms that's just a non-starter for a lot of people. I mean, only 5% of Americans hunt. It's the smallest it's ever been, and it doesn't show any signs of growing. But there are a lot of ways to engage with nature, and it doesn't necessarily involve carrying a gun. But when you go out into nature, you start to see the things that we've tamed and pushed off. Like, well, I mean, here's the one thing I think, like, another thing, and there's a chapter about death. I think as pastors, I mean, I'm sure you sit with people as they die and you do funerals, you think about death more than most people because it's just part of your job, And I think that's another thing, like the butchering of meat, that it's unfortunate that we've lost it, and there are ways to re-engage with death so that we're aware that we're mortal. I mean, this is Christian, and this is also, like, in a lot of other religions and even in non-religious, like, philosophical traditions, is that if you keep your own mortality front and center in your life, you will live a better life. You'll treat other people better. You'll do the things that are important. You'll do less of the things that are unimportant. And I think when you go out into wild places, you just are quickly acquainted with death, because it's not hidden away. It's right there in front of you. I have this line in the book about, it doesn't take you long walking in the woods till you see the picked clean rib cage of a white-tailed deer, where I live. And that deer lived a life, and that deer died at the hands of a predator or disease. And then all sorts, everything from coyotes to turkey vultures to tiny little microorganisms ate every piece of meat off that deer. And that rib cage kind of stands as a testament to the life and death of that deer and the cycle of life and death that we all are a part of. So that's, I just think you're asking how we do it. I'm kind of more, I guess, talking about why we should do it, but how we do it, I think, is, life is so comfortable. It really is comfortable. You go from an air-conditioned house into your air-conditioned car. I did it today, and then I drove to the gym, and I worked out. I wasn't splitting wood. I was at a gym and I was lifting weights, and then I sat in the hot tub, and then I took a shower, and it's a very comfortable life. Making it hard to say I'm going to deliberately place myself in some discomfort. I'm going to go out to a place where I'm going to get bitten by bugs, and I might get rained on, and I might stub my toe, and I'm a little confused because I don't know which way to go. So it takes a deliberate effort to do it, I think. Like, frankly, any spiritual practice, like anything in the Christian life, and prayer doesn't come naturally. You gotta like discipline yourself and make the time and do it. Yeah.
It's all very intentional, and we got to get out. And and our comfort is crippling us in so many ways. We need to get outside of our comfort zone. The great stories go to those who don't give it to fear, which is a motto that my wife and I try to live by, and just getting into it, into these great stories. Yeah. So, when you go out into the wild, is there a place for you where the noise of the world turns off, shuts down, you could focus what's in front of you? Where's this place that you just, like, joy starts to rise up in you, quiet is there, and that you could be connected with the place and the person that you are? Where is that place for you?
There are a few places, but one of them definitely is the place I've already mentioned, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, which is this nationally protected wilderness on the border with Minnesota and Canada. And I can even tell you when it happens, because when I get in you get in a canoe, you go to one of your launch sites, you have to have a permit, you go to your launch site and you put in your canoe and you start to paddle. And sometimes there's a little parking lot by the put in, and there's usually some people. There might be people coming out and other people going in. So there's it's like a half dozen, but there's still other people around. It's sometime, depending on which, where you put in, but you make that first turn around a bend, or you circle around an island and open into a big lake and start paddling, and then everything falls away. And so it's that journey, I think, into the lakes of the Boundary Waters, and then arrive at the first campsite for the first night and get that fire going and get my hammock slung between a couple trees and start a pot of coffee on the open fire. Somebody pours a little bit of whiskey in the bottom of the coffee cup, and we pass it around and we start to talk about the day, or I'm there alone and do it by myself, just me and my dog. So that's kind of one of those sacred places for me. And yeah, I had some pastors up there last year, and we were driving back to the Twin Cities, and I asked my buddy Jason, who's a pastor in Virginia, what'd you think, man? What'd you think? The Boundary Waters? He's like, so many lakes. He's like, it's unbelievable how many lakes there are. And that was good for me to hear, because I take it for granted a little bit. Of course, there's a lot of lakes. Like, that's what Minnesota's all about, right? But so though that there's something for me, some people it's ocean, some people it's mountains. For me, it's lakes.
That's beautiful. These two halves of life for you, it looks like. Yeah. One is it looks like the containment and the certainty of the church world, of trying to make things certain. And it comes out sometimes in your writing as well, as you're prescriptive of, like, this is it. This is the way to do things, right? This is what God is like. Into the wild, which is uncertain and not tame and all over the place. And your writing now is a lot more descriptive.
That's right.
Than before. What was that for you to actually kind of shift some of your writing and what you were trying to say and what trying to do?
I'll tell you exactly when it was, Joshua. I'll tell you exactly when it was. It was my agent saying, you need to rethink this book. And you should and here's my challenge. He's like, go reread some Barbara Brown Taylor. So I did. And I happen to be friends with Barbara, and so I reread Learning to Walk in the Dark. And if your listener don't know, she's a very famous Christian author and writer, beautiful, beautiful writer.
Yeah, she's amazing.
Yeah, and I called her, and I just was rereading your book. Here's one thing I noticed, like you never say should. You never say you to the reader, you should do this. There's none of it's not prescriptive in any way. And she said, "Oh, Tony, should. That's how men talk. That's not talk." And I was like, "Ooh, ouch." You're exactly right. All of my previous books were, here's how you should understand the atonement. Here's how you should pray. Here's how you should plant a church. Here's how you should do youth ministry. And I had to relinquish all that and say, I'm going to do like Barbara does. I'm just going to write my story and what I've learned, and I'm going to trust the reader to be smart enough to make those connections on his or her own, to be like, oh, Tony, it's been very gratifying for readers to get back to me and say, I don't hunt, I will never hunt, but I loved your book, and I found myself in it, which I think is the goal of any memoir, is that readers would find themselves in the story of the memoir. And so people who don't even hunt and never will, but to still be able to read it and be like, I found myself in it, and I thought, oh, I should try blah, 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 blah. So that was a big pivot. You're exactly right. It was very different than all my previous books.
Well done. I know that's a hard process to shift some of that thinking and to write a different way, a different style, and be more descriptive and telling your story. And it's hard sometimes to be able to tell your story. Your last chapter, as you get into this, you actually get to God in your last chapter.
I do.
And
kind of back my way into it, yes.
You back your way into God.
Yes.
And so where then, if you, for so many years and decades, found God, in your vocation, in the things that you did, and the work that you did, and then you go into the wild, where are we finding God? Where did you start to find evidence of a creator in the wild?
Yeah. Well, first of all, on that last chapter, I mean, just to show you how reluctant I felt so burned. Not burned. That's not quite right. I felt like for so long I had been telling people about God and what they should think about God and how they should understand God. And that hadn't really worked out for me. Like my life didn't work out the way I thought it was going to. So I was very reluctant to write anything normative about God. Even though I got a PhD in theology, like that's what they taught me to do, make normative truth claims about God. I was very reluctant, and my editor was like, dude, you got to land the plane. There can't be a book called The God of Wild Places where you don't actually write what you've learned about God. So that's why I say I kind of backed my way into it. It's something you and I just touched on a couple minutes ago. It's not that different from walking into church. There's two ways to walk into church. You can walk into church and think, I'm here to see my friends, and it's what I got to do, and I got to get my kid to Sunday school, and I got to, listen to another sermon and whatever. Or you can walk into church and say, I'm going to deliberately engage in the content. I'm going to try to quiet my heart during the prayer times. I'm going to pay attention to the lyrics of the songs. I'm going to be conscious. I'm going to be mindful. I'm going to be fully present in church this Sunday. Well, you can't necessarily do it, 52 Sundays a year or whatever, but you know what it takes some kind of conscious effort. It's the same. I think for me, it's the same. It's sure. Of course, there are lots of people who go out there and hunt, and they're just like, I want to shoot the biggest buck I can shoot. Bang, bang, high five, like Instagram pictures. Look at the huge rack on this buck, blah, blah, blah. That's not the way I hunt. That's not the way I want to hunt. I want to be conscious. I want to be mindful. I want to say I'm out here to meet the creator of all this. I'm part of this creation. I'm engaged in it. This is a web of life that I'm a part of. I'm a predator There's prey animals. We're in a symbiotic relationship. Don't know why God set it up this way, but that's the way God set it up. I don't know why we have to eat other animals. And I mean, we don't have to, but yeah, basically we've been doing it for a long, long time. Seems kind of ludicrous that we eat other animals. I mean, I guess God could have set it up so we didn't have to eat it all. There'd be other ways for carbon-based life forms to sustain themselves, but that's not, we're in it. We're just in it. So if I'm going to be in it, then I want to be conscious. I want to be mindful of the sacredness of this act of being in the world, and and even of pursuing prey animals, and being part of that relationship. So I think how I find God and where God speaks to me is in those moments when I'm conscious, when I'm mindful of it, when I pay attention, as opposed to just going through the motions.
Yeah, that's so good. Paying attention is so important, and that's what being out in nature and in the wild has taught me, that I need to pay attention, see where God is. What is one hope that you have for your readers to read your book?
Well, I mean, you gave me the best compliment, honestly, by already saying that you enjoy the writing, because I have worked really hard at the craft of writing. I read books about writing all the time. I'm constantly trying to be a better writer. So one hope I have is that people are like, oh, dang, this is like well written. This is really, because I've been an editor. I was an editor for 10 years at a publishing house. And so I've edited a lot of Christian nonfiction. And let's just say not a lot of it is really what people don't get book contracts in the Christian world because they're really good writers.
Right.
They get it because they have a good platform and they have good ideas. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
So that's like at first pass, I hope people are like, oh, it's a well-written book. But yeah, I guess on the content side, I do hope that people will, even people who don't hunt, it's not really billed as a hunting book, because that's not really what it's about. That's a foil for a journey of self-discovery. So I guess I hope people would give it a chance and think, oh, how is my own life? How am I on a journey like this author is on a journey? Even though it's different, where are the intersection points? Where are we running on parallel paths? Stuff like that.
Yeah. A couple questions I love to ask at the end. One, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
I don't know your personal life, but I'm sure you know people like me. It's hard to say, I wish I wouldn't have been in a toxic marriage when you have 3 kids as a result of that marriage. So I can't really say like I regret it. I would say to my 21-year-old self, like, choose more carefully. I guess what I would probably say to my 21-year-old self is like, as much as you love theology, there just aren't jobs for like straight white guys to teach theology anymore. So maybe think about another profession. I mean, that would be the vocational advice I'd give for myself. But I'm sure I wouldn't listen because I was an arrogant son of a gun at 21.
Yeah. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you can recommend?
Let's see. I think I read a lot of science fiction, and one book I'd say that I read like a year ago that I've been recommending a lot is called The Sparrow. And it's a science fiction novel, but it's really a theodicy. It's pretty incredible. It's about a group of Jesuits who get on a spaceship and fly to another planet. But it's really incredible, really well written. But it just deals with a lot of deeply moral and theological issues. Yeah, so that's one that I'd recommend.
Interesting. Sounds great. I'm going to go out, look that up after we're done.
And then there's a sequel called Children of God. Yeah, I think you'd like them both. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Tony, how can people connect with you? How could they go out and get your book, The God of Wild Places? Where would you like to point people to?
godofwildplaces.com is the best. It'll redirect you to my website. You can, all the online retailers, you can buy a copy directly from me. If you want me to sign it or sign a copy and send it to somebody as a gift, there's an option to do that. There's the audiobook is read by me. That's available. It's obviously as an ebook as well. So yeah, godofwildplaces.com.
Well, that's great. Well, I read your book and I did listen to the audiobook as well because the audiobook is fantastic. You did a wonderful job.
Somebody told me recently, somebody texted me and said, do you realize that when you're talking about your dog dying in your lap, you gasp, and they left that in the audiobook? And I was like, no, I didn't know.
Wow.
But I'm just glad you didn't get to a chapter in the audiobook that was like read backwards by accident.
I know. That's great. Tony, thank you for this conversation. I really do hope people go out, get The God of Wild Places. It is a fantastic book, well written, and it inspires me to find God in the wild, to go in the wild. It didn't work, but I have talked to my wife. I said, hey, we need to get a house out in the wilds, and we need to be in a place where there's woods and there's water.
Yeah.
But she's like, yeah, not right now. So
all right,
it's
keep trying.
To get there, but hopefully one day.
And thanks so much for having me on. Great conversation. I really loved it. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron of the show. You can help us produce more episodes so that we can see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. If you become a patron on patreon.com/shiftingculture, you will get early access to episodes. You will get episode guides. You will get bonus shows, hopefully, and more. So go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron. Also, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out and helps us find new listeners to the show. And just go and share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network, people that you think would enjoy it as well. Thank you again for listening to the show. I hope you have a great week.